Hi there. I'm a historian. If you're having trouble sleeping tonight, I think my story might just help you drift off. For now, all you need to do is close your eyes. And if you have headphones nearby, go ahead and put them on. Let my voice and the sound of rain carry you gently into sleep. Now then, let's begin. Before the sun even dares to rise over the gilded rooftops of Versailles, we are already awake. There are no roosters to greet us, no gentle light filtering through linen drapes, only the clatter of wooden soles on stone floors and the low hiss of whispers traded in the dark. In the servants' quarters, tucked away far from the gold-leafed walls and crystal chandeliers, the day begins with haste. There are no windows in our sleeping quarters, only the damp breath of others sleeping close, the smell of straw mattresses and worn linen. My name is Antoine, and I am one of the 300 staff members who make Versailles function, while the nobility play their games above. I am not a noble. I do not dine beneath frescoed ceilings. I do not waltz through marble halls in powdered wigs. I polish them. I carry their perfumes, hold their chamber pots, dress their children, and open the doors they never touch. I wake not for pleasure, but for the task of maintaining illusion. Versailles is not just a palace, it is a theater, and we are its invisible stagehands. By 4:30 in the morning, the first assignments are already whispered into our ears by the chief steward. Today, I am on King's chamber duty, a dangerous blessing. One misstep, placing the wrong shoe near the bed, wrinkling the wrong velvet, speaking without being spoken to, and I'll be scrubbing chamber pots for weeks. But it also means proximity to the Sun King himself, or rather, the man who pretends to be him now. They say King Louis XIV still haunts these halls, his image etched into every wall, every mirror, every protocol. Though we now serve Louis XV, his predecessor's ghost looms large. I make my way through a hidden corridor, a narrow stone passage that snakes behind the Hall of Mirrors, accessible only to us, the invisibles. These passageways reek of candle wax, sweat, and secrets. They are our roads, our arteries connecting the beating heart of the palace to the limbs that move in silence. At 5 o'clock, the palace begins to stretch awake. You can hear it, the creak of wood under fine shoes, the echo of footmen rushing to fetch hot water, the hiss of kitchen fires being lit in the bowels of the building. I pass a mirror in one hallway, not one meant for nobles, but an old cracked one we use to ensure we appear invisible enough. We must never outshine the decor. Our clothes are plain gray, dust-colored, designed to disappear against the marble. I smooth my collar and knock twice, softly, on the mahogany door of the king's antechamber. Another servant opens it, eyes wide with nerves. "He is not yet stirring," she whispers. I nod. We tiptoe in. It is our job to prepare the room before the king's lever, the daily ritual of His Majesty, rising in full view of his court. The velvet drapes must fall exactly so. The fire must crackle, not roar. The floor must gleam like glass. And the golden robe he wears must be aired, scented, and folded precisely. Otherwise, a duke will notice, and the blame will not fall on the robe. The king himself does not rise until 8, but by 6 the room is alive with silent motion. I fetch the tray, bearing his silver morning flask, pour the warm water for his hands, check the shaving tools, adjust the wax seal on his correspondence tray. I touch nothing I am not permitted to. I look no one in the eye unless necessary. To be noticed is to risk. The footmen begin filing in next, bowing in precise cadence, each awaiting their part in the rising spectacle. Nobles are already assembling in the antechamber outside, eager for their moment in the daily performance, an audience with the king during the first seconds of his waking life. At 7, the royal clock chimes. We retreat from the room like shadows melting into walls. I pass by a kitchen boy hauling a copper pot of broth, his face red from heat. He nods at me. We do not speak. There is no time. Versailles does not rest for sympathy or friendship. It only feeds the machine. As I pass into another hidden corridor, I hear the distant murmur of the Queen's household beginning their day. In a few hours, I may be reassigned there or to the stables or to the grand chapel. One never knows. There is a rhythm here, but never routine. Every day is a new performance. Every mistake, a spotlight. I reach the servants' alcove just behind the Hall of Mirrors. Through the wall, I hear the rustle of silk. The courtiers are arriving. Versailles has officially awakened. Beneath the dazzling mirrors, beneath the gold, beneath the grand chandeliers that drip like frozen sunlight from painted ceilings, Versailles has another body. It breathes differently here in the underbelly. Down in the service corridors and vaulted cellars, the palace feels colder, more honest. The air is heavy with the smell of damp limestone, boiled root vegetables, firewood, and the occasional rat. This is where we, the backbone of Versailles, live, work, and vanish. They call this the service level, though no noble foot has ever touched it. It is a city beneath a palace, a maze of tunnels and rooms that support the illusion above, like bones beneath velvet skin. After the king's chambers have been properly staged for the day's spectacle, I descend the narrow spiral staircase back into the lower halls. My shoes echo against the flagstone as I pass the laundry corridor. A blur of motion women, scrubbing lace and linen with numb fingers, their knuckles raw from soap and lye. The air is thick with steam and the sharp sting of vinegar. In a nearby room, a seamstress threads golden trim into a nobleman's waistcoat, her eyes red from lack of sleep. She has 2 hours left before the coat is due for a promenade appearance in the gardens. Every mistake will be seen. Every stitch is judged. Further down the hall, the cooks are in a frenzy. Dozens of them, chopping, stirring, shouting. Their white smocks already stained with grease and wine hands flying through motions so fast it looks like choreography. They prepare not just food, but theater. Dishes must dazzle, not just nourish. The king's breakfast alone requires over 30 hands, pastry chefs, meat carvers, sauce makers, bread boys. I pass them as they salt slabs of venison and slice oranges into perfect spirals. One boy is skinning a hare, humming quietly to himself. This too is part of the palace's performance. Nobles gossip over food, judge each other's plates. They don't just taste, they compete. A lukewarm soup could damage a reputation more than a failed duel. But deeper still, past the kitchens and the laundry, lies the truly hidden world, the living quarters of the servants. My quarters. Our ceilings are low. Our rooms are shared by 4, sometimes 6. There are no windows, only thin straw mattresses and wooden pegs for hanging garments. You sleep when you can. You wash when no one is looking. You speak only in hushed tones because someone is always listening. Gossip is currency, and alliances here are delicate. Too friendly with the wrong steward, and you could find yourself reassigned to the stables, a fate worse than illness in winter. I head toward the scullery to check on water pails and warming pans. Every hallway down here hums with activity maids fetching fresh linens, boys hauling coal scribes running notes from one wing to another. Occasionally you catch a glimpse of something strange. A masked noble slipping through a back hallway, a note dropped too quickly into a hidden hand, the flash of a blade under a coat. Versailles is not just a palace, it is a labyrinth of secrets. Today, I'm told I may be assigned to the Queen's apartments by midday. A rare opportunity, and one fraught with risk. The Queen's household is a world unto itself, ornate, meticulous, and full of rivalries. Her ladies-in-waiting are unpredictable, alternating between cruelty and boredom. One of them once had a servant whipped for bringing lilac water instead of rose. Still, the queen is said to be kind. Detached, yes, but not unfeeling. Rumor says she keeps a secret diary. Another says she sleeps in a separate room from the king. Still, another claims she orders sugar from Martinique, laced with pearls. We servants know better than to believe anything. We believe only what we see, and even then, cautiously. As I wait in the stairwell for my next instruction, I see a boy, no older than 12, rush past with a tray of silver polishing paste. His face is drawn, his wrists thin. He's new. Probably sent here by a mother hoping for a better life. Poor child. He hasn't yet learned that Versailles consumes hope. It sparkles, yes, but it devours. The king's table might feed 200, but we eat scraps. The nobles receive bouquets of roses in crystal vases. We wash our hands in cold buckets. And yet, despite it all, there is something magnetic about this place. It pulls you in. Versailles is a living organism. Above it dazzles. Below it sweats. But both levels depend on each other. The marquises and duchesses in their powdered wigs would be nothing without the men and women who light their fires, empty their chamber pots, and iron their silks. We are not seen. We are not thanked. But we are necessary. And deep down, we all know this. Even as our hands blister, even as our eyes blur from sleeplessness, we move with purpose. Because for all its cruelty, Versailles gives us something strange, something quiet, a sense of being part of something colossal. And perhaps for those of us born with nothing that is its own kind of glory. The message came just after the second bell. To the Queen's wing. Immediately. That was all. No name, no signature. Just the words scrawled hastily on a folded corner of parchment and tucked into my palm by a steward whose eyes never met mine. Orders here are often like that, cryptic, unspoken, and urgent. I didn't hesitate. I washed my hands at the basin with cold water, wiped them on the hem of my tunic, smoothed my sleeves, and made for the private stairway that curved toward the upper floors, toward the domain of Marie Antoinette. The Queen's wing is unlike the rest of Versailles. While the Hall of Mirrors boasts power, and the King's chambers demand respect, the Queen's apartments possess something else, softness. At least that's what it appears to be. There are pastels on the walls, lavenders, soft greens, eggshell blues. The chairs are smaller curved. There are more fresh flowers. The scent in the air isn't musk or tobacco. Like in the king's court, it's rosewater and powdered citrus. But beneath this gentler facade, there is a sharp edge. The Queen's inner circle is a world of glances and whispers of favors, bought with secrets, and dismissed with a flutter of lace. One misstep in this wing can cost you your post, your dignity, or worse. I enter through the servants' passage, a narrow slit of a hallway that runs behind the Queen's salon de thé. It's lined with portraits of women I don't recognize, some smiling, some not. Through a tiny window in the paneling, I catch a glimpse of Madame Campan, the Queen's first lady-in-waiting, directing another maid to adjust a flower arrangement. She moves with the precision of a general. When she speaks, others jump. She's known as the gatekeeper to the Queen. Impress her, and you might be summoned again. Displease her, and you're forgotten. My assignment is simple, at least on paper. Bring a freshly embroidered handkerchief to the Queen's chamber. But nothing is simple in Versailles. I carry the handkerchief wrapped in silk embroidered with the Queen's monogram, delicate silver thread, looping around tiny fleur-de-lis. It smells faintly of jasmine. The handkerchief was not meant to dry tears, of course. It was meant to be seen to be displayed in a gesture that seems effortless, but took 3 people and 6 hours to prepare. As I enter the outer room, a young lady in waiting glances at me. Her lips do not move, but her eyes scan me entirely, judging the cleanliness of my hands, the crispness of my sleeves, the steadiness of my breath. I bow slightly and offer the silk bundle. She takes it without a word and disappears into the chamber. I wait, still, silent. Minutes pass. A clock ticks in the corner, shaped like a golden harp. It plays a chime every quarter hour, but its tune feels mocking in this moment. I know better than to shift my weight, to scratch my face, to even breathe too loudly. Finally, the door opens again. She returns, nods, and gestures for me to follow. I do. The queen is seated at her dressing table, a mountain of mirrors and perfumes, combs and powders, jewels and lace. Her hair is half styled. One side curled high, the other still unpinned. She wears a silken robe embroidered with tiny roses, and her expression is unreadable. Two other women flit around her like butterflies, one adjusting earrings, the other brushing a stray thread from her sleeve. She does not look at me. That is expected. I place the bundle where instructed on a specific tray near a porcelain figurine of a shepherdess. Then I step back. One of the women pours a tiny cup of tea for Her Majesty, which she accepts with fingers as pale as porcelain. The queen raises the cup, sips delicately, then speaks for the first time. "Tell Madame Campan the blue ribbon will do." Her voice is calm, controlled. I don't move. Her words were not for me. As quickly as I arrived, I am dismissed. Outside the chamber, I finally allow myself to exhale. My knees feel weak. My palms are sweating. But I did not falter. That is victory. That is survival. I return to the servants' corridor, and as I pass by a small window, I glimpse the Queen's garden. It is pristine, manicured, not a blade of grass out of place. I know how many people it takes to keep it that way, how many backs bend, how many hands bleed, how many hours are poured into an illusion of effortless beauty. This is Versailles, a masterpiece painted with sweat. As I descend the stairway again, I cross paths with a steward carrying a sealed note. His face is blank, but the corners of his mouth twitch. "Change of duty," he mutters. "You're needed in the marble court. Something about a noble guest." And just like that, the Queen's perfume is behind me, and I'm off toward another theater, another set of rules, another script to memorize. The day is far from over. In fact, at Versailles, it never truly ends. The marble court is not the grandest space in Versailles, but it is one of the most dangerous. Not for its architecture, but for the egos it contains. This is the crossroads of influence, where ambassadors arrive, where nobles parade themselves like peacocks, and where the king himself might pass by on his way to the council chamber. Everything here must be perfect. The floor must shine like a mirror. The statues must be dusted until they seem alive. The air must smell faintly of cedar and clove, never sweat or polish. When I arrive, a foreign dignitary is already expected. I am not told who. We are rarely told names. Names belong to their world. Ours is the world of linens, wax, and silence. My task is to assist with the final preparations, adjust the chairs, light the tapers, align the velvet ropes exactly 2 thumb widths from the wall. The man overseeing the work is Master Vaudet, a silver-haired stick of a man whose voice never rises above a whisper, but somehow carries like a cannon. He spots a servant sweeping in the wrong direction, and with one look has him reassigned to kitchen ash duty. No one argues with Master Vaudet. I work quickly and without speaking. Every time I step back, I check the reflection of the chandeliers in the marble floor. If it's not symmetrical, I begin again. There's a particular tension in the room today, one I can feel more than see. The noble guests who gather in the antechambers are dressed to intimidate coats, stiff with embroidery wigs, towering like monuments rings as heavy as cuff irons. They speak in quiet barbs, laced with formality, but sharpened like daggers. Politics here isn't conducted in meetings, it's played like chess across every corridor. As we finish the last touches, a low rumble of drums echoes from outside. The visiting party is approaching. Everyone snaps into place. I take my position near the wall behind a velvet curtain, just close enough to respond if something goes wrong, but invisible enough not to offend anyone's sense of decorum. I've stood in this spot before. I know what's expected to blend into the architecture to become furniture. The only time I must act is if I'm summoned, or if something breaks. And in Versailles, nothing is allowed to break. The guests arrive in a flurry of silk and boots. Their leader is tall, pale with a high brow and cold eyes. He says nothing as he enters, but the courtiers around him begin to orbit like moths. His coat is lined with dark fur, Russian perhaps, and he wears gloves that he never removes. A signal maybe, or a tactic. In Versailles, everything means something. The king does not appear right away. That is by design. Time in Versailles is a weapon. The higher you are, the longer others must wait for you. Meanwhile, I notice a young noblewoman drop her handkerchief. Two men bend to pick it up at once. Their eyes lock. A smile. A threat. A story begins that will end in scandal, perhaps even blood. But that's not my story. I return to the curtain. I wait. When the king finally enters, his blue sash, gleaming his steps, practiced, it is as though the room itself bows. No one speaks until he does. And even then, the conversation is not really conversation. It is performance. Compliments wrapped in strategy jokes that hide barbed assessments. Silences that mean more than words. I observe from the shadows. I see a minister smile with his lips while his eyes betray a war inside. I see a general adjusting his medals every few seconds like armor slipping. These people wear power like a second skin, but you can smell the fear beneath it. As the court exchanges formalities, servants like me begin preparing for the next stage, the refreshments. Nothing extravagant, just enough to symbolize Versailles' wealth without tipping into vulgarity. Silver trays are lined with sugared almonds, spiced wine, and delicate wafers. I carry one careful not to let the crystal glasses clink too loudly. I offer them without eye contact. One nobleman accepts without looking. Another waves me away as though I were a gnat. It's expected. Suddenly, there's a loud clatter. A tray dropped. Not mine. On the far side of the room, a young footman no older than 17 stands paralyzed. A goblet rolls across the marble. Red wine stains a noble's silk shoes. Silence slices through the chamber like a blade. The boy mutters an apology. Too late. The noble's face twists. He says nothing. But Master Vaudet appears within seconds. With a single motion of his hand, the boy is removed. I know what that means. We won't see him again. As the dignitary and the king move toward a more private chamber, the rest of us begin cleaning the remnants of the reception. I mop the wine. I reset the goblets. The marble court must look as though it has never been touched. That is the rule of Versailles. Beauty must be effortless, no matter how many hands bleed to make it so. As I return the tray to the pantry, I pass a mirror in the hallway. I see myself posture straight face, blank clothes immaculate. I am no longer Antoine, the son of a baker from Lyon. I am a piece of Versailles, polished, silent essential. After the marble court had emptied of its powder and perfume, and the echo of foreign boots faded back into the stone, I found myself reassigned once again, this time to the orangerie and the Queen's Garden Pavilion. Some might call it a reprieve, but I knew better. Working in the gardens was no less dangerous than serving wine beneath chandeliers. Here, amidst the roses and hedges, whispers traveled faster than sound, and secrets clung to the air like pollen. Versailles was as much a trap outdoors as it was within. The path to the gardens took me past the southern wing, down a marble staircase rarely touched by nobles, and through an arched passageway cooled by the stone beneath centuries of footsteps. I emerged into the light, the kind of filtered gold that only Versailles seemed to command. The gardens were an illusion of nature, too perfect to be wild, too calculated to be free. Everything here had a purpose. The angle of each tree, the spacing of every tulip. Even the bees were said to be bred for gentleness. The Queen's Pavilion, nestled in a secluded grove behind the rose hedges, was less formal than the palace, but more dangerous in its intimacy. This is where Her Majesty entertained in private, less court, more salon, but still teeming with tension. Today's task: assist the outdoor stewards in setting the space for an afternoon of simple pleasures, which of course required 5 kinds of tea, 6 varieties of sweets, and a miniature orchestra hidden behind trimmed hedgerows. I arrived early. The lead steward handed me a checklist longer than a confession. Polished porcelain sunshade, linens, the proper arrangement of flowers, pink tulips in the center, white roses in the outer ring, and lavender for aroma never placed too close to the teacups. The Queen's guests were known to faint if a fragrance competed with their drink. As we worked, musicians arrived one by one, lute, flute, violin. They set up discreetly out of sight because music was to appear as if summoned from the heavens, not from the labor of men. I saw them glance around nervously. They too understood the stakes. If the tempo was off or the volume wrong, even by a breath, the entire ensemble could be dismissed, or worse, replaced by Italians. The Queen arrived precisely at 4. She stepped from a covered carriage wearing a dress the color of morning fog, her wig towering and powdered to perfection. Her attendants followed like petals in the wind. The guests, all women today, were dressed in softer colors, each one a carefully crafted image of innocence. But I'd seen these women before, laughing too loudly near courtiers, brushing gloved fingers against the wrong arms. Versailles was full of eyes, but even more full of masks. I took my place among the silent ones near the edge of the garden, beneath the shade of a trimmed cypress, holding a silver tray in case it was needed. I was not meant to be noticed, but I watched everything. Lady Saintonge spoke first something about the poor quality of Parisian lace this season. The others giggled. The Queen sipped her tea, not responding. Then came the topic they'd all waited for: the Comte de Verneuil recently returned from an assignment in Vienna. They spoke of him as one might speak of an opera, dramatic, indulgent, filled with secrets. One of them said she saw him in the Queen's corridor at dusk. Another claimed he was meant to marry the Duchess's daughter, but had instead kept company with an actress. I watched the Queen's eyes narrow just a touch, only a servant would notice. The music began softly, a waltz just enough to break the tension. The ladies turned toward the hedges, pretending to be delighted by the sudden harmony. The Queen smiled then, not a full smile, but the kind Versailles specializes in: cold, unreadable, layered-in implication. As the ladies continued their chatter, I noticed one of the Queen's guards approach a pavilion maid. He slipped her a folded note, barely brushing her hand. She bowed, disappeared. Moments later, another servant, one I recognized from the East Wing, entered the grove. He wasn't supposed to be here. His eyes met mine briefly. He gave the smallest nod, then vanished behind the trellis. This was how Versailles spoke. Not with voices, but glances. Not with truth, but half-truths, folded into gestures. Love, betrayal, blackmail, they all dance together here, disguised as politeness. by the time the sun dipped low and the Queen rose to return indoors. I was already helping pack the leftover biscuits and tea sets. The music faded. The birds returned. And the illusion of peace once again settled like silk over everything. Back in the servant halls, as I handed off my tray and received my next instructions, I felt the weight of the day press behind my eyes. The Queen's garden had been beautiful, yes, but beauty in Versailles was just another weapon, and today I had stood near its sharpest edge. The chapel bells rang like clear water poured over marble, signaling not just prayer, but preparation. That evening, I was summoned to assist in the royal chapel, La Chapelle Royale, the spiritual heart of Versailles. Towering and white, gilded in gold and divine silence, it was less a place of worship and more a theater of piety. It was here that God met monarchy, and where with each sermon the Sun King's divine right was reaffirmed by the echo of Latin over pipe organs. By the time I arrived through the lower servant entrance, the chapel was already half lit. Dozens of tapers flickered from sconces mounted on Corinthian columns, and a line of choir boys rehearsed in the corner, with voices so pure they hardly seemed human. The scent in the air was a blend of beeswax, old wood, and incense. I was assigned to pew cleaning and hymn leaflet distribution tasks, simple in name, but dangerous in detail. One crooked leaflet, one unswept step, and someone might slip or worse offend a bishop. I moved silently between rows of polished oak benches, wiping away dust that hadn't dared to settle. Every time I stood upright, I caught glimpses of the massive royal balcony above, reserved solely for the king and his closest circle. No one else dared ascend those stairs. The priests would enter from the sacristy, the nobles from the side aisles. We, of course, entered through tunnels. We were not meant to be seen. Only our work was. Just before the ceremony, the court arrived. Rows of powdered heads bowed as the Queen entered, followed by princesses, dukes, and foreign dignitaries in carefully embroidered velvet. The king came last, flanked by guards, his robe of state brushing against the marble floor like a whisper of thunder. All eyes fell on him, and yet he did not see us. That too was expected. The service began with a hush. The organ let out its first low moan, and the choir's voices soared upward, slipping beneath the arches like birds finding invisible currents. The priest spoke slowly, deliberately, his Latin accent pristine. But while the words filled the chapel, they barely touched the people. This wasn't about God. It was about power, reverence, display. A kingdom ruled not only by law, but by ritual. I stood still in the side alcove behind the tall candlesticks. From there, I could see the subtle theater of the court, a nobleman pretending to pray while stealing glances at a duchess. A lady's maid dabbing her mistress's tears before they smudged her rouge. A younger son of a count mouthing the hymns while clearly thinking of other things. Versailles trained you to watch without staring, to listen without reacting, to know without speaking. And I had learned. Halfway through the service, a commotion stirred in the side gallery. A late arrival, one of the Spanish delegates entered noisily, his boots echoing louder than the organ's final chord. His servant, red-faced, trailed behind him, holding a damp cloak. The Queen's eyes flicked sideways. The king did not turn his head, but I saw his knuckles whiten. The chapel held its breath. In moments like these, reputations began to crack. The priest continued without pause, but I saw the steward beside me make a small mark on his schedule. Later, someone would answer for this. Perhaps a demotion, a reassignment, or something quieter. After the homily, the Eucharist was brought forth. The altar glowed with polished gold and holy light, and the silence grew so thick I could feel it pressing against my ribs. This was the moment when the people believed they saw heaven touch France. The king knelt. The Queen bowed. The choir swelled. I stood in the shadows, holding a candle steady. My hand ached, but I didn't let it shake. When the final blessing echoed and the incense was released into the vaulted air, I felt it more like smoke than salvation. The nobles rose, each according to rank. They filed out slowly, peacocks in prayer. When they had gone, we moved in. Silent, fast, efficient. We doused the flames, swept the marble reset, the hymnals. The chapel would need to shine again tomorrow. Always perfect. Always sacred, no matter how many feet had muddied its floors. As I exited the chapel through the servants' passage, my clothes still smelled of incense and wax. The hallway outside was dim now, the sun gone, and only the humming torches remained. I passed a group of kitchen boys whispering about a spilled tureen of soup. Down one corridor, I saw a lady-in-waiting slap a maid across the cheek, then vanish behind a velvet curtain. Versailles never truly sleeps. It only dims its lights. I made my way back toward the staff wing. My limbs were heavy, my feet numb. But my mind burned with the knowledge of what I had seen. Power in its purest form, wrapped in prayer, performed like theater. And I wondered not for the first time if God had ever truly been there at all. Night at Versailles does not bring rest. It brings transformation. As the final light fades behind the gilded roof lines, the palace shifts. The grandeur doesn't vanish. It deepens, becomes something more theatrical, more intimate. The laughter gets softer, the perfume heavier, and the games more dangerous. By the time I returned to the servants' quarters, it was well after sundown. A thin layer of exhaustion clung to my skin like oil, but I had no time to wash. I was already being sent to the north wing for a late engagement, a private entertainment, the steward said with a raised eyebrow, which in Versailles could mean anything from a poetry recital to a duel behind drapes. The hallways were quieter now, but not empty. Candles flickered in wall sconces, their light dancing across polished wood and mirror. Somewhere music floated faintly from behind a closed door, a harpsichord playing a melancholy tune. Down another corridor, I caught the distant tinkle of laughter. Not joy exactly, something more calculated. I arrived outside the appointed salon where two guards stood stone-faced. They didn't question me. The silver tray in my hands was answer enough. Inside the room glowed. Velvet-covered walls, heavy with gold trim. A fire crackled in a marble hearth. Around the room lounged half a dozen nobles' faces, flushed with drink and heat, each reclining in a way that seemed studied. The women's fans fluttered like butterflies. The men's smiles were too white, too slow. At the center sat the Comte d'Artois, the king's brother known for his appetite for entertainment that blurred lines of propriety. His eyes, dark and sharp, caught mine for a moment. Not recognition, just inspection. I bowed and offered the tray. He took a candied fig and turned back to his game of cards where fortunes were being won and lost with each flick of the wrist. No one asked who I was. That was the rule. Servants were shadows. As the evening stretched, the air grew thick. More wine was poured. The conversations became less careful. A duchess removed her gloves slowly, like an undressing. A viscount boasted of his horses while letting his hand linger too long on a companion's knee. Behind it all, whispers moved like wind gossip about the queen's rumored affairs, about the king's latest war council, about who might be arrested next. Versailles at night was more honest than Versailles by day, but its honesty was poisoned, laced with ambition. I was sent twice to the cellar for more bottles. The second time I passed two men arguing in hushed tones near the stairwell. One held a sealed letter, the other had tears in his eyes. I did not stop. I did not listen. To know too much in Versailles was to sign your own ruin. Back in the salon, a masked woman had joined the group. No one asked who she was. That too was the rule. She laughed softly, sipped something from a jade cup, and then whispered something into the comte's ear that made him tilt his head and smile. Later, I'd hear that a lady of the court had vanished the next morning, her apartments emptied in silence. But tonight, no one spoke of that. Near midnight, a commotion began on the eastern balcony. A group of nobles emboldened by drink had decided to race down the marble hall on velvet cushions, sliding across the polished floors like children. Their laughter echoed down the walls, bouncing off centuries of royal portraiture. I stood quietly at the door, pretending not to hear, pretending not to feel the absurdity of it all. Just before I was dismissed, a servant girl passed me eyes wide with something close to fear. She was carrying a silver box. I knew her. Her name was Elise, and she worked in the Queen's dressing rooms. We locked eyes for a brief second. She shook her head almost imperceptibly. I would not ask. I never asked. When I returned to the lower levels, the kitchens were quiet, but still warm from the ovens. A lone baker kneaded dough by candlelight, his sleeves rolled up flour dusting his hair like snow. He did not look up. Behind him, another servant snored softly on a sack of potatoes. We all sleep where we can. I made my way back to my quarters. The corridor was darker now, lit only by moonlight slipping through a high window. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. Or maybe it was a man crying. In Versailles, the two often sounded the same. I laid down on my straw mat boots, still on arms aching. I stared at the low ceiling and thought of the Queen's gardens, of the boy who dropped the goblet of the woman in the mask. I thought of the comte's laugh. And I thought of my own silence, how it had become my armor, my currency, my only real possession. Versailles did not sleep. Neither did I. Not really. Dawn at Versailles is not a moment. It's a quiet invasion. The first light slips through cracks in ancient stone and begins its ritual dance across silk curtains, golden molding, and slumbering portraits. The palace doesn't rise with the sun. It resists it, grudgingly returning to life after a night of carefully staged chaos. I awoke before the bell, the ache in my shoulders reminding me of every staircase I'd climbed the day before. The straw in my mat had flattened during the night, leaving little between my ribs and the cold stone beneath. Still, I stood. In Versailles, you never wait for orders, you anticipate them. The corridor outside my cell was already stirring. I passed other servants moving with urgency, maids adjusting aprons, stewards retying cravats, a boy of perhaps 10 struggling to carry 2 water pails twice his weight. No one spoke unless they had to. We communicated in nods and glances. Words slowed you down. Today, I'd been assigned to the Petit Trianon, the Queen's private retreat, a place built to resemble simplicity while costing more than a small city. They called it rustic. But the marble floors, the hand-painted walls, and the fleet of gardeners told another story. The walk from the main palace to the Petit Trianon was long enough to feel like exile. The gravel paths were quiet, lined with statues whose blank faces mirrored our own. By the time I arrived, the early mist had settled low across the garden, clinging to hedges like silk on skin. It was beautiful. It was a lie. Inside the Trianon, the Queen's staff were already preparing for her morning tea. Unlike the court rituals at Versailles, her mornings here were informal, but that only made the details more important. The placement of a teacup, the freshness of a fig, the angle of a lace curtain, any of it could be the subject of a royal mood. I was given the task of arranging the flowers for the breakfast table. 3 vases, one for roses, one for lilacs, and one for violets, all handpicked that morning, and approved by Madame Bertin, the Queen's preferred stylist. I worked carefully, slowly. My fingers moved as if I were threading a needle in the dark. The result had to look natural, but not too natural. Versailles taught me that perfection must appear accidental. When I finished, Madame Bertin gave the smallest nod. It was the closest thing to praise I'd ever received from her. As the Queen approached, announced by the soft creak of her slippers and the whisper of her entourage, we stepped back. She wore a simple muslin dress cinched with a blue sash. Her hair, though looser than usual, still held the shape of royalty. She sat without speaking. A lady-in-waiting poured tea. Another unfolded a napkin. I remained still, barely breathing. Then, without looking up, the Queen murmured, "I smelled violets. Lovely." Just 5 words. But in that moment, I knew I'd done something right. I'd made her day gentler, if only by a breath. The rest of the morning passed in careful rhythm. A walk through the garden, the feeding of her chickens, yes, real ones, kept for aesthetic and amusement, and a reading of correspondence. I followed at a distance, always invisible, yet always near. That's how you survive here. You exist just outside the line of sight, but always within reach. As midday approached, a messenger arrived. His coat bore the mark of the King's inner council. The Queen took the note, read it once, and handed it back without a word. Her face didn't change, but her pace quickened. The rest of the day would change with that message, we all knew it. By early afternoon, I was sent back to the main palace. The contrast was immediate. The air was thicker, heavier. The sounds louder. I passed a hall where 2 guards argued in hushed tones. Another corridor was being scrubbed furiously. Word had spread the comptroller had misfiled a report, and a minister's son had been caught in the opera house with a courtesan. Everything has a price at Versailles. Every error, every rumor, every misplaced look. And as I returned to my quarters for a moment of stillness, I realized something terrifying. I remembered the Queen's smile this morning, and I feared it more than her silence. Because at Versailles, smiles are never just smiles. They're weapons, shields, warnings. And no matter how many dawns you survive, the day ahead is never yours. By late afternoon, Versailles had begun to sweat. The summer air, thick with perfume and secrets, hung low in the halls, like an unwanted guest. The mirrors reflected golden light across floors, worn down by centuries of silent footsteps. But even beauty in a place like this begins to rot if you look too long. That's when the tension started to thicken so subtly, so quietly, that only someone like me would notice. It began in the East Corridor, where a steward named Laurent tripped over a loose rug near the Dauphin's study. Not a dramatic fall, just enough to send his stack of reports flying. Pages fluttered everywhere, like startled birds. Normally, this would be nothing. A minor mishap. But nothing at Versailles is minor. Not really. Within minutes, whispers spread. Some said Laurent had dropped confidential documents. Others claimed the pages revealed inflated grain reserves. One servant swore he saw the comptroller himself snatch a sheet and vanish into a side room, his face pale. The truth, I didn't know. None of us did. But it didn't matter. By the time I was summoned to help prepare the King's antechamber for the evening assembly, the palace's energy had turned electric. People were moving faster. Doors closed more sharply. Eyes darted. Something was happening, and we were all caught in its current. Inside the antechamber, we were ordered to replace all upholstery on the guest chairs. Why, no one said. But urgency dripped from every syllable. As I pulled the worn velvet free and stretched new fabric across the frame, I caught fragments of conversation from the valets nearby. They say the minister's son was involved. The Dauphin's tutor is being questioned. I heard it came from the Queen's own circle. I kept my head down and my ears open. That's what keeps you safe. Then came the real blow. Elise, the quiet maid from the Queen's dressing room, the same girl who passed me in silence the night before, was gone. Vanished. Her bunk stripped. Her name removed from the roster. No explanation. Just absence. In Versailles, that is often more terrifying than punishment. Whispers turned to panic. Some said she stole a necklace. Others believed she knew too much. A few murmured that it had to do with a letter intercepted in the early morning. I remembered her face, the way her eyes widened before she shook her head at me. I should have looked away. I should have forgotten. But I couldn't. Later that day, I was reassigned to the wine cellars beneath the main kitchens. A demotion? A precaution? Perhaps both. The darkness there was complete, the air cold and damp, like an underground confession. Barrels stacked like monuments. Rows of bottles older than I was. A steward named Jules handed me a ledger. My job was to inventory, by candlelight, slow, silent, anonymous work. While counting, I overheard Jules muttering. He was talking to himself, but loudly enough. This place eats people, he said, tracing dust off a burgundy cask. Not just the poor ones either. It eats everyone. Just slower if you're dressed better. I didn't reply. There was nothing to say. He was right. By evening, the palace had quieted again, but not in the usual way. This wasn't peace. It was the silence of a room where everyone is waiting for a scream that hasn't come yet. I returned to my corridor and found a note slipped under my door. No name, just 5 words. Don't mention Elise. Ever. I didn't sleep that night. I lay on my back, listening to the distant clatter of carriage wheels, the flutter of paper, the slow dripping from a leak in the corner of the ceiling. Versailles is never silent. Even in its quietest hours, it hums with judgment. In the darkness, I thought about all the things that could go wrong, the accidents that aren't accidents, the glances that last too long, the names that disappear. And I understood something deeper than fear. Survival here wasn't just about silence. It was about forgetting. Letting go of truth like a splinter you don't dare pull out. But I hadn't forgotten Elise. Not yet. And that was going to be a problem. I woke to the sound of boots. Not the usual shuffle of servants rushing to their morning stations, but the sharp, calculated rhythm of authority. My heart snapped awake before my eyes did. I stayed still, ears straining. Then the door opened. 2 men entered, one in the black and silver coat of the Royal Guard, the other in plain brown, which somehow felt more dangerous. The second one spoke first. "You work in the Queen's pavilion?" "Yes," he asked. Not a question, an assertion. I nodded. "Come with us." They didn't say why. They didn't have to. I followed them down a service stairwell I'd only seen once before years ago, when another servant had been taken for questioning after silver went missing during a banquet. He never came back. That story had passed through the servant halls like fire, whispered under breath, until it became folklore. Now it was my turn. They led me into a small room, stone walls, a single chair, no windows. The plain-clothed man sat across from me. "We need to ask you about Elise," he said. I froze. The name felt like a dagger dragged across a scar. "We know she spoke to you the night she disappeared." I didn't answer. Not because I wanted to protect her. I didn't even know what she had done, but because I didn't trust my voice not to betray me. After a moment, he leaned in. "Listen," he said quietly. "You're not in trouble. Yet. But this palace, this place feeds on people who hesitate." I found my voice. She didn't say anything. I replied. She just looked scared. She didn't even speak. "Even fear is a message," he said. He stood, nodded to the guard, and left the room without another word. They returned me to my post that afternoon, like nothing had happened. But everything had changed. Word traveled fast. Other servants looked at me differently now, some with suspicion, others with sympathy, most with avoidance. I was marked, not by stain or punishment, but by attention. And in Versailles, attention is the deadliest poison of all. That evening, I was reassigned yet again, this time to the Hall of Mirrors, for a diplomatic reception. It was the kind of event where everyone smiles too wide and says too little. I carried trays of champagne past rows of glass that reflected more lies than light. The ministers from Prussia were in attendance. Their uniforms crisp, their laughter hollow. Our nobles matched their cadence, each chuckle, hiding an insult, every toast layered with politics. I recognized the Comte d'Artois again, lounging near the second column. He saw me, narrowed his eyes slightly, and said nothing. But he knew. Somehow, he always knew. Midway through the reception, a goblet shattered, dropped by a footman whose hands were shaking. The music stopped for a breath, then resumed. The boy was gone before I could see where they took him. Backstage, behind the velvet drapes, a kitchen maid whispered to me. They say Elise saw a letter. A real one. Not gossip. Something political. From Vienna. That's why she vanished. Another said, they think she meant to sell it. A third muttered, or expose it. The truth slipped through every rumor like water through cloth. You could never catch it whole, never drink from it safely. That night, as I returned to my quarters, a folded scrap of paper lay on my pillow. I opened it with trembling hands. Stay quiet. Stay still. Watch the mirrors. No name. No seal. Just the advice of a ghost, perhaps. I lay down, but didn't sleep. Not truly. I stared up at the ceiling and counted every breath like I might run out of them. Versailles had always been a place of games, but I'd been wrong to think I wasn't a player. I was on the board now, and someone had just moved a piece. The next morning felt different. Versailles had always carried tension in its marble bones, but today it vibrated with something else: anticipation. Not the elegant kind that accompanied royal weddings or foreign dignitaries, but a kind that whispered behind locked doors and lingered behind drawn curtains. Even the birds in the gardens seemed quieter, as if they too were holding their breath. Word spread quickly. A royal ball was to be held that evening in the Hall of Mirrors, an unplanned, unscheduled affair ordered directly by the king himself. That alone made it suspicious. Events of that magnitude took weeks, sometimes months, to prepare. But this had been declared only hours prior, and when the king moved that quickly, it was never for celebration. I was assigned to floor maintenance, an excuse to be stationed near the dais where the king and his closest advisors would be seated. But it didn't feel like a coincidence. Nothing did anymore. The palace became a hive of frantic activity. Flowers arrived in bundles. Footmen carried crates of wine through side corridors. Musicians were pulled from nearby provinces and dressed in Versailles livery as if they'd always belonged. Servants practiced their bows in hidden corners, terrified of doing something wrong. No one knew what this ball was really for, but everyone suspected it was a test. As I moved through the antechambers with a tray of polished glasses, I overheard bits of conversation, loose threads in a fabric I couldn't yet see. They say it's about the Queen's letters, or the Prussian envoy. I heard it's to trap someone from inside, and then that name again, Elise. Some said she'd fled to Paris. Others claimed she'd never left the palace and was being hidden by someone with influence. One story insisted she'd been sent to a convent, gagged and under watch, but no one really knew. The truth was a ghost that haunted everyone's words. As the sun dipped behind the treetops and the great chandeliers of the Hall of Mirrors were lit, the transformation began. Versailles once again donned its mask of splendor. The marble gleamed. Gold flickered. The mirrors, tall and infinite, reflected perfection. But I knew better. I'd seen the cracks. Guests arrived in waves, dukes, duchesses, foreign officers, bishops. Perfume filled the air so thickly it was difficult to breathe. I took my place near the side stairwell, close enough to observe, but not close enough to be noticed. Then the king entered. The room silenced at once. He moved like a man already written into myth, his every step rehearsed by generations. Beside him walked the queen, her expression unreadable. Behind them, the Comte d'Artois and the Minister of War, each face carved in polished stone. Music swelled. Dancers filled the floor. But the real choreography was happening in the shadows. I saw a guard pass a folded paper to a steward who slipped it into a ledger. A footman nodded subtly to a noblewoman in blue. The Comte whispered to a chamberlain who quickly vanished into the side gallery. Every movement had purpose. Every gesture contained risk. And then I saw her. At first I thought it couldn't be. But there she was, Elise, dressed as a noble guest, her hair styled high, her face powdered her gown, a pale silver that shimmered with every flick of the candlelight. She didn't walk like a servant anymore. She moved like someone who knew she was being watched and chose to be anyway. She crossed the ballroom, slowly stopping only once to meet my eyes. Just for a second. No fear, no smile, just awareness. Then she turned away. The air tightened. Shortly after the music stopped, the king stood. All eyes turned. There are those among us, he began, his voice low but sharp, who mistake discretion for loyalty, who think that secrets can be held in the dark. He paused. No one moved. Tonight we remind ourselves that Versailles does not forget, nor does it forgive. He nodded once, and two guards moved swiftly into the crowd. They did not move toward Elise. They moved toward the Comte d'Artois. Gasps rang out. A few guests tried to appear surprised. Others didn't bother. The Comte laughed a bitter, humorless sound and extended his wrists. Of course, he said. It was always going to be me. They led him out in silence. The ball resumed as if nothing had happened. Elise was gone. Later, I returned to my chamber to find another note. Just 2 words. Thank you. Versailles in the hours after a royal spectacle does not rest. It exhales, not loudly, not violently, just slowly, like a beast that's fed for now. The morning after the ball, the palace was quieter than usual. Not calm, never truly calm, but quieter. The kind of silence that drips down marble walls and pools in corners where secrets used to stand. The servants still moved, still polished, still bowed. But there was something in the way their shoulders held themselves tighter higher, like people who'd just walked through fire and weren't quite sure they were alive. No one mentioned the Comte. No one dared say Elise's name. Versailles had turned the page as it always does, as if it hadn't just rewritten someone out of history. But I remembered. I carried the memory like a hidden cut, small, sharp, and permanent. The day returned to its rhythm trays, linens, timetables, formalities. A princess required fresh roses. A foreign bishop needed assistance with his carriage. A marble statue's pedestal had cracked and was being quietly replaced before the king noticed. All of it felt painfully normal. That's how Versailles protects itself. Not with swords, but with routine. With rituals so deep, they smother rebellion under layers of etiquette and polish. In the lower kitchens, I caught sight of Jules again. He didn't speak, just nodded. We both knew too much to pretend anymore. Later in the servants' corridor, a girl slipped a folded cloth into my hand. Inside was a violet. No note, no explanation, just a flower. A symbol of a memory neither of us dared say out loud. That afternoon, I passed the Hall of Mirrors again. A painter was repairing a flake of gilding near one of the window frames. He worked in silence, dabbing gold leaf onto a palace that demanded it remain perfect even after everything. That's what struck me most, not what had happened, but how little it seemed to matter. Versailles kept spinning. The fountain still sprayed. The queen still wore lilacs. The king still held court as if no arrest had occurred, as if the mask had never slipped. By sunset, I was back in the queen's garden trimming ivy that would never be seen, watering roses that would be replaced tomorrow. I paused for a moment under a marble statue of Apollo and listened to the wind stir through the hedges. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to feel something dangerously close to peace. And then, like a ghost returning to its grave, I remembered the note. Thank you. I never learned who wrote it. Maybe Elise, maybe someone else. It didn't matter. What mattered was this: I had survived. Again. And at Versailles, survival is the highest form of rebellion. As night fell once more, the palace shifted again. Light-faded secrets returned to their shadows, and the mirrors waited patient eternal ready to reflect tomorrow's version of the same carefully choreographed lie. I returned to my straw mat. I laid down. I closed my eyes. And I dreamed not of kings or queens or betrayal. I dreamed of violets.